Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ryan 𝐲𝐬𝐀𝐬. I'm an advocate and a practicing attorney, and I here at dLCV. I am moderating today's panel, and we'd like to thank you for joining us to a session entitled Youth Mental Health. It's never too early to talk about it. Our presenters today are Nicole Hunter, Miranda Schnoor, and Julie Cabral. Ms. Cabral will join us when she's able. But before we get started, I'd like to set down a few housekeeping rules. Speakers, please remember we're using live captioning and interpreting services. When you first introduce yourself today, whether as a speaker or participant later on, please include a physical description of yourself and your preferred pronouns. So for me, I am a white man with black and gray hair. I am wearing a blue shirt and a navy jacket. In the background behind me, I have a pride flag and two colorful portraits, one of Marsha P. Johnson and the other of James Baldwin. My preferred pronouns are he and him. This will help provide context for our attendees who may be blind or vision impaired, and will also help our interpreters and captioners locate who's speaking and when they're speaking. Please, if you're with us and not a presenter, please remain muted at all times during the discussions and hold your questions until the end. We have a chat box which will be monitored by myself. Please use the chat box to ask questions or responses if the speakers ask for responses. At the end of our session, if there's time, I'm going to select some of those questions to present to our presenters, and I won't be able to get to all the questions, but hopefully we'll get to quite a few of them. Nicole Hunter, if you would like to please take it from here and introduce yourself.
Yes, no problem, Ryan. So my name is Nicole Hunter. I am an African-American female who is currently wearing a sleeveless shirt, navy blue with a light pink. I have a braided bun, and in my background, there is a hint of red and cream colors. I am also a New Jersey native. I came to Virginia to go to school, graduated with a bachelor's in education from Virginia Union University and a master's degree in clinical mental health counseling from South University. I have been practicing as a therapist for the past 10 years. I have started my own therapy practice in Richmond, Virginia, called Healing Hearts Counseling Agency. I also have worked with youth, adults, couples in a variety of mental health ways, servicing them for anxiety, depression, trauma, and grief. I'm really happy to be here to speak with you guys today.
Great, thanks so much. And Miranda Schnoor, if you would like to introduce yourself, please.
Yes, thank you, Ryan. I'm Miranda Schnoor. I am a white woman. I'm wearing a white collared shirt with puffy sleeves. I have brown hair and it's pinned back right now. My background is blurred, but it's a yellow-green color. And I work with, and I use she, they pronouns. I work with NAMI Virginia. NAMI is the National Alliance on Mental Illness. And my role at NAMI Virginia is their educational support and helpline coordinator, which means that I run some of the educational programs as well as overseeing the statewide helpline, where I work with people all across the state to connect them with a wide variety of resources depending on their needs.
Great, thank you so much. Let's jump into our first question, which is what are some good ways to start dialogues about mental health with youth?
In my practice, I feel the best way to tackle this is to start to discuss emotions with them and help them to build a broader emotional vocabulary. a lot of times we are focusing on 4 core emotions, but it is helpful to help youth to explore the range of emotions that are in our vocabulary and that we all have access to. And so starting there is one of the most, I think, easiest and safest ways for them to start conversations about mental wellness.
Thank you, Nicole. I would love to add on to that a little bit from what I've done in an educational sense. And what I have learned is that starting that dialogue often also means creating that established safe space, especially if you're coming from a point as an educator, as a caregiver or guardian or a parent, being able to take time to research and reflect on your own mental health before having important discussions with that youth in your life. And non-reactivity can be especially important when you're beginning these conversations with the youth in your life. Can be very difficult to hear about when a loved one is struggling, especially if it's not something that we've noticed or really feel like we have the capacity to help with. But letting somebody talk without a fear of judgment or punishment for their feelings and their thoughts is so important. An additional thing I've learned there, just adding on a little bit, is and this is a little bit more serious, but if you're noticing your youth exhibiting symptoms of suicidal ideation, I have learned through ASSIST, which is Applied Suicide Intervention Skills Training, that asking directly about suicide can be a really useful tool, especially if you believe that it is something that your youth is thinking about. Being able to ask directly can really open up that conversation, even though it may be a little bit scary at first.
Miranda, I do thank you for adding those conversations about suicide with youth, because it is a real thing, that there are several youth who have contemplated and had thoughts of harming themselves, as well as your conversation about being safe. One of the things is, I feel like youth just want to be heard, and we have to make sure that we're opening conversation for them in a way that allows them to feel safe and not judged, so that they can communicate whatever it is that they're feeling and going through at the time.
What are some warning signs you look out for at various ages when you're evaluating youth mental health?
Well, there is a wide range, because of course with mental illness itself is a very vast topic. And so there may be some signs that are very small, and in that not as seen as significant, such as maybe they're impulsive. But then there are other signs that are more alarming, such as their like maybe more erratic behavior, difficulty with managing their moods. So going from a very calm space to a very irritable or volatile space. So I would say one of the things when you're talking about signs, it's important to notice, be good observers of not just the verbal communication, but the nonverbal communication. So if they're staying in their room, they're keeping things in a very dark capacity, that might signal that they're going through some feelings of depression. If they're isolating from friends and family, changes in weight and appetite are also some signs that there may be something deeper going on than just, I had a bad day.
Thank you for that, Nicole. I love hearing your insight on this. I really think the only thing that I have to add there would be thinking about what is developmentally appropriate versus what might be a sign or symptom of a mental health condition. Because with a teenager, it is developmentally appropriate for them to withdraw from family and move more towards friends and outside social connections. But like Nicole was saying, if they're withdrawing from both friends and family, that may be a signifier that something bigger is going on.
What trends are you seeing in mental health outcomes for American youth, particularly as we come out of this time of pandemic, and it seems to be a time of transition? What are those trends that you're seeing?
I spent some time working with AmeriCorps, teaching out in a school system with K through 3, and that was within the last few years. And it was very interesting to see how these students were coping in the wake of a pandemic when they didn't have that social support, especially at such a young and formative age. And I think the pandemic is something that has impacted all of us, no matter our age, in terms of social skills, feelings of anxiety and depression, things that might show up as symptoms of mental health conditions. What I do think is a positive aspect of this, not of the pandemic, but of the greater ability for young people to access resources on the internet, because there are so many very good and very helpful resources for young people that exist out on the internet if they don't feel comfortable sharing with a close, trusted adult, or if they don't feel that there is a trusted adult in their lives. So there are resources like Child Mind Institute, and they have resources for very young children ranging up through youth and young adults. The JED Foundation is another really good resource for youth and for young adults, learning about their mental health, learning how to cope with mental health issues, and being able to recognize issues that may arise with their friends or their loved ones, and learning how to talk about it. I think that there are lots of very difficult things that people have had to cope with, but it is very good that these resources are easily accessible.
Ryan, one of the things that I feel like I'm noticing is that there are more youth who are seeking support. I think that, as Miranda shared, that was a very difficult time for all of us. And I think that allowed for the youth to explore in ways that they hadn't before, their own mental capacities and wellness. And, I think that they started to feel okay with admitting when they weren't okay, that, they were experiencing feelings that were different from before. They were anxious about going to school or engaging with others. They were feeling depressed, maybe even having some symptoms of trauma due to the impact of COVID on their particular family and inner circle. So I feel like it just really, it allowed for us to be able to have that door to open for them. And I think it also allowed for adults to actually see that youth are dealing with things in a very enormous way that impacts them both emotionally and mentally as well. I feel that there previously, children and youth have not been looked at as closely in regards to mental wellness. And if when it was primarily on a academic standpoint, whereas now we are looking deeper into the impact of things in life that can exacerbate how they are negotiating social situations, educational, academic goals. All of those things have just been kind of spotlighted since COVID, because now we adults are seeing more and more that they have feelings, they have their own needs too.
Great, thank you. Miranda, you talked a little bit about the positive the positive resources that for youth mental health that you can find online. I wanted to ask you both about the opposite side of that coin for a moment, because there are many harmful internet-based groups and ideologies that our kids have to navigate online. From pro-anorexia content to cyberbullying to incel culture. I wanted to ask how has youth mental health been impacted by the landscape of social media and these troubling subjects?
I guess one of the things, Ryan, that really just comes to mind for me is when you mentioned cyberbullying, that kind of like struck a chord, because in my work with some of the youth, bullying does come up. And unfortunately, you know, the bullying that is of today is a very different level than what we have maybe experienced in the past. And so cyberbullying in itself is a real thing. And with a lot of the youth being involved on the internet, in social media, it can feel unescapable. Whereas before, you know, there was a stopping point, if you will. You know, once you maybe left school, got on the bus, or entered your home, you felt safe. But now, you know, because kids are very much involved in social media and on the World Wide Web, it appears to be for them very hard to escape the impact of cyberbullying, and it has become, I think, in a way more harmful than it had in the past, because the level of intensity as to which these youth are bullied, and I think the wide reach as well, because before it was a very, you know, like singular focus, and now the reach is widened by that ability to have World Wide Web and social media presence. And so that's one that sticks out for me, for sure, as being a negative and a piece that we have to figure out how to get better control over for them.
I completely agree with you, Nicole. I think it feels like an overwhelming topic to tackle because there aren't any immediate answers for how to fix this or for how to make this better for youth. One of the things that stuck out from your question, Ryan, is the existence of these online forums such as pro-anorexia content or incel culture or internet spaces like that, where they can show up even if you aren't searching for them, and expose such young children to such harmful content. And really the only solutions that I can think of are ones involving a very, I don't know if this is necessarily a solution, but having parents involved in having conversations with their youth about the content that they are consuming online, and talking about the existence of these harmful things and why they are harmful. Because I think as a parent or a caregiver or a guardian, it can be easy to not want to acknowledge these things because of how scary and overwhelming they can be. And having those conversations with your youth and knowing that they have a safe place to go to, that they can talk to you about the content that they see online, is, I think, important, especially seeing how young children are with unrestricted access to the internet. As I was teaching K through 3, it was truly shocking to me how many of my second graders, my third graders had unrestricted access to the internet, and how they were able to just consume content that, to me at least, did not seem like it was developmentally appropriate or like it might have an adverse effect upon them in the future.
Great. Thank you so much for that insight. Could you both speak a little bit about the 988 hotline development, and whether you think that has or has not affected mental health in Virginia, or youth mental health in Virginia?
I can jump on that, if you don't mind, Nicole. Say a lot of what I do with the helpline is speaking with people across Virginia, and we've stayed very up to date on what is going on with 988. And I think it is remarkable how Virginia has brought 988 into our state. We are one of the leading states with having 988 operators and faster wait times to be able to talk with an operator. I personally think that having a confidential service like that, a confidential free 24/7 crisis service, can really only have a positive impact with all people. But I think with youth as well, because again, there may not always be a safe space to go or a safe, trusted adult. And so having resources like 988, where you can call or text at any moment of the day, I think that that can be incredibly useful, especially because they can also direct towards other resources that exist that a person might not be aware of. So I do think that it has very much a positive effect on mental health, at least in terms of crisis response.
And Miranda, I just want to agree with you that it is great to have that as a resource. So one thing I would like maybe to see more of is more communication about its availability and even about the confidentiality of. And I know that there are some people who've had negative experiences before with crisis supports. And so I think I personally have been in communication with someone who I felt warranted needing that support as a backup, because as a therapist, I'm available, but I'm not available 24/7. And so the one thing that I felt that person was concerned about was being possibly either judged or even involuntarily hospitalized. And I had to, have a lot of a real conversation with them about it. But I think that was the one thing that I feel like would be helpful, is just really being able to get more information about it out and about what it really is and what it's not. Because I think there's some people who have bad experiences with crisis support and may not be using it when they need to.
Well, that leads me into my next question, which is how do you both feel we should better educate providers about things like 988 and how best practices? How can we educate providers who interact with youth, people like teachers or administrators in the schools or even law enforcement, to recognize and respond to those mental health concerns appropriately?
That is a good one. I think it comes with more training opportunities to educate them on one, mental health in itself, but also definitely with crisis situations and how to best support, whether it is a child in their classroom or a child in a home. Those are the pieces that I think sometimes can be missing. I would say it definitely needs to be communicated, and they need to be aware, not just the school counselor, but everyone in the school should be aware of 988 as a hotline to share with their young youth around them. So that way, if they did feel like there was a child who maybe needed someone to talk to, that it's kind of as common as 911. I feel like it should be that common to everyone. If you know 911, you should know 988 and what the purposes for using them are. I also would say that we have to help those folks, those providers, the teachers, the police, to, going back to what Miranda said earlier, is to be mindful of their own mental wellness. Sometimes in the work that these folks do, they're not always as present with their own self. And when they are coming into contact with youth, they could be triggered or not respond in the most trauma-informed way to help that youth make the decisions that we want them to make, which is seek support, call 988, go get counseling, talk to, a trusted adult. And so those would be the things that I would say. What about you, Miranda?
So yeah, I completely agree with you. And that leads me into thinking about a couple of different avenues. Say the first is that I with providers understanding their own mental health, I completely agree. I always love the expression, you can't pour from an empty cup. And I think that's very true, is that you can't provide the support and assistance that a youth would need if you aren't able to figure out what you yourself need and take care of that. But the second part of that with the trainings, and I agree with that as well. I had the privilege of taking part in a youth mental health first aid training. And I think that trainings like youth mental health first aid can be really useful for anybody who is working with youth in really any capacity, whether that is as a teacher or working somehow in a school system, whether that is serving as a coach, maybe in a religious capacity, wherever you have somebody who is going to be working with youth. I think having them do a training and go through a training like the youth mental health first aid can be very helpful for understanding, what things might be signs and symptoms, getting to know a little bit more about the resources that are available and that they can direct youth to, like 988 and other resources too, because there are certainly resources out there. And what I see every day is that it is very difficult for people to figure out, what resources might apply for them or to be able to find them. And I very much think that we need to find a way to streamline that so that people understand more easily what resources are available to them. But I do think having trainings like that can be really valuable. NAMI actually also does implement a few different trainings. We have one called Ending the Silence, where 2 young adults with lived experience with mental health conditions will come to schools, usually junior highs or high schools, and talk about their experiences. And it has helped some young people identify things going on with themselves that they may not have realized were perhaps signs or symptoms of a mental health condition. The other thing I do think with CIT training, it can absolutely be a very useful tool with law enforcement and first responders to have that mental health education. And I think the lived experience panel of that can often be really valuable as well, having people come in and share about their own experiences with their mental health. So I think there are a lot of things right now that exist that may not be utilized as much as they could be.
I just want to piggyback on that for a bit, because you mentioned the youth mental health first aid, and I, as a former educator, I do recall that my district had provided an opportunity for specific folks in our building to attend that. And I think the one thing I recall about that is the funding. One of the hard parts about sometimes bringing this information to the masses, right, is funding. We have to have funding to allow everyone to be able to get the knowledge about mental health and about trauma so that they can engage in a more informed way with our youth. And that would be the one thing I would add to that.
Thank you both so much. I want to stay on schools for just a moment and talk for a little bit about something else that teachers have been receiving training for recently, and that is school shootings. Unfortunately, school shootings have become an ever-present reality in our nation. And how have you noticed that's affecting the mental health of our youth? And also, do you feel that the conversations, sometimes it feels like the media puts conversations of gun safety and mental health against each other? What are your thoughts on the effects of blaming mental health for school shootings?
That's a tough one, Ryan. Because the reality is that if someone is not mentally well, they can make very impulsive decisions that impact others. However, I think from my, personal opinion, there's no one or the other. I feel like we have to address both issues here to keep our kids safe. Because if we had better supports for mental wellness and better control with guns, then we would have less likelihood of the shootings. And so for me, I would say it's a twofold thing. As a former teacher myself, I recall even before the shootings have become so prevalent, we had trainings in how to respond to these things. I think the issue now is that they've become more of a reality than they once were. And especially, I would say, thinking about, the elementary level, I think we didn't really, I'm going to say I didn't, as an elementary teacher, did not think that I would have to fully be prepared, because that was more of a high school, college thing. And I think that's what has happened now is we've become really just anxious about the possibility in itself, and about shootings no matter where you go these days. And so I think, just going back to what you're saying, I think that we need to address both sides of the coin to help make a difference. And as far as the impact on our youth, I want to start by saying youth are resilient. So they are resilient, and in that respect, I don't believe it's impacting them fully. However, it does have the capacity to. And I think the more it occurs, those who are not experiencing the trauma directly are definitely possibly being exposed to what we call vicarious trauma because of the repeated shootings. And even, again, going back to your original access to World Wide Web, they are actually looking at everything online. And so they're not even being protected themselves from the videos of what is occurring. They're communicating, live, like right in the moment of everything happening. So I feel like from that perspective, I feel like, the youth are resilient. However, those who are not directly involved are at risk for vicarious trauma. And that can result in a lot of different things for them, whether it's anxiety, whether it is, some depression. It just, trauma impacts in various different ways. And so that part for me is a concern.
Thank you for that, Nicole. I feel like you just articulated everything I was thinking about in terms of, yes, it being a double-edged sword. And from an educational perspective, I feel like as I've grown up, this has been a very, very prevalent thing in my education, a very prevalent anxiety. I was in middle school when the Sandy Hook shooting occurred. I remember coming home and talking with my mom about it and hearing it from her. And the way it is now, you find out about these things very much in a real time. And being in an elementary school in the last few years was, as an educator, it was anxiety inducing, thinking about, where I would bring my students if in the case, like if a school shooting were to take place, having that be something that I was thinking about, which is just, it is really tragic, I think, how much it is impacting so many people across the country. And I do want to add a couple of resources, just because that is a big part of what I do, that do exist surrounding gun violence and the trauma that can result from gun violence. And one of those is the Giffords Courage to Fight Gun Violence Toolkit. They've got some good resources for survivors of gun violence in schools and for allies. And Child Mind Institute also, I think I mentioned earlier, they do have some good resources for children, for adolescents and for young adults, as well as parents of all of those ages. And they have a few that are specifically devoted to trauma, which could absolutely be helpful for both youth and for parents and guardians and caregivers in the wake of events like that, or as we process events like that happening in our communities.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing those resources. I want to switch gears for a moment and talk a little bit about LGBTQIA youth. It's known that that LGBTQIA youth who live in homes that are not gender affirming are at a greater risk of suicide. Given the rise of anti-trans sentiment and legislation across the country, have you noticed a change in the mental health trends for this specific population here in Virginia?
This is another tough one. I can't speak directly to the Virginia population, but I will say that I have noticed in general across the country, especially in areas where anti-trans legislation is being introduced and anti-trans sentiments are prevalent. And some of that does take place here in Virginia, unfortunately. It absolutely has an impact on LGBTQIA youth mental health. I think it can absolutely increase odds of depression and anxiety and suicidal ideation as well. Because if there are people working to create a world where your existence is not safe and protected, I think that can absolutely create a huge sense of doubt, anxiety, and depression surrounding your identity and who you are. And that it is a very unfortunate and tragic thing, because I do think it has absolutely an impact on these youth.
And I echo what Miranda said. It's hard to say specifically about those just in Virginia. However, nationwide, it is very debilitating for them. You know, I think, again, going back to youth, children want to feel safe, want to feel heard and understood. So when they're in homes and or environments that aren't affirming to them, we are causing them to have signs or symptoms of mental illness. And that's just a fact. If they don't feel that they belong, we are causing them to feel like they're isolated and alone, and which is, again, exacerbating the possibility of them having a mental illness. And so it is a huge issue. And I think that we have to do better about helping them as they are exploring, and as this is also just a normal part of development, is figuring yourself out, figuring out who you are. And that might mean for some of them figuring out their own gender identity.
Thanks. I want to move over and talk a little bit about the quote unquote troubled teen industry. What can you both tell us about the troubled teen industry, and what are red flags that we should all be aware of if someone's considering residential treatment centers for a child?
Okay. I guess a red flag for me is if we have not considered any other sources of treatment prior. And again, are we hearing them? Are we looking at their behavior to determine what it is they're trying to achieve or communicate? Because bad behavior is communication, okay? Kids often use behavior as a way of communicating something, whether it's the tantrum of a 2-year-old who isn't getting what they want, or the rebellion of a teenager who is trying to become independent and, you know, have their independence like shouting from the rooftop, like whatever. Behavior is a force of or source of communication. And so we have to, I think, stop and look at the behavior. And really, before we label it bad, identify what that behavior is actually stating. What are they trying to achieve? And we have to consider what are some precursors that may have come before the behavior that maybe, you know, we missed out on some things. Maybe we didn't realize that, hey, you know, they were feeling very alone. And during this transition, we just moved to a new town. They were getting picked on. They were the new kid. And we just kind of glossed over all of that. And now we're labeling them the bad kid because they're acting out, they're skipping class, they're doing whatever, you know, we consider as bad. And I think that would be, to me, before we go to residential treatment, we have to let's roll it back a bit and make sure that we've explored all options and really looked at what the child, because they're a child, what the child needs.
I completely agree with you, Nicole. And I think that we at this point do really know how traumatic the troubled teen industry can be to those who have to go through it. And I think that if you do reach a point where it seems like residential treatment is the best option after having explored the other avenues, after having, you know, operated in the best of faith and working with the other options that are available, and that's still something that you and your child want to explore, then I think there are questions that you can ask, you know, is this facility licensed and accredited? Are all of their staff fully licensed and accredited and appropriately and currently? What is the staff to patient ratio? Do they have licensed providers on call? What kind of behavioral modification strategies do they use? Will there be an appropriate individualized care plan? I think that if a parent really is trying to act in the best of faith to their child, you are allowed to ask all of the questions and vet the facility and make sure that it is something where your youth will be taken care of in a way that is positive and hopefully not traumatic to them. You know, you don't want to increase whatever trauma or difficulties they may be experiencing. And so I think as a parent, a guardian, a caregiver, there are a lot of things that you can do to ensure that that does not take place. You are allowed to ask those questions and to look at different facilities. And if they have a mental health care provider, like a therapist, asking about referrals and what that therapist might actually refer, because I think those two, if you have a provider that really works for you, they will help to make sure that your youth is sent to a place that is safe and affirming and will help them.
And I would just add, remember to stay involved. You know, even when they're there, they're not there just to, I guess, give you the break. Although I know that parents, you guys need a break, and I get it. But we need to make sure that you stay involved. And yes, like Miranda said, ask the questions. You have the right. You have the right to investigate and to consult and make sure that the placement that you are choosing for your youth, your child, has their best interests, because the goal is for them to leave there a better youth, leave there ready to join our society, community, and be involved. And so it's not going to help if they're not leaving their whole.
Well, I wanted to also ask if either of you, if you could recommend effective alternatives to acute psychiatric hospitalization. I also wanted to ask you if you think acute inpatient care is more helpful or harmful, and when do you think it may be absolutely necessary?
Ryan, you trying to get us in trouble? I'm just kidding.
I will stir as much as I can.
Whew.
I appreciate the frank answers that you're both giving us, and the forthright information. So
Yes,
I'm not trying to ask any gotchas here.
no, I know. I'm just kidding. Okay. I'll start with maybe inpatient care and we'll go from there because I know there were a couple of points that you asked, Ryan. I think inpatient hospitalization can be helpful, but only if it is actually warranted. Okay. I think that there have been times where youth have been hospitalized, but because of behavior, and the family felt that their behavior was uncontrollable. And so they went the route of trying to get them hospitalized. And so I think that that's not always the best option because hospitalization is really needed when there is some level of psychosis, that the actual youth has a threat to harm themselves. And it is a very serious threat. It is not, you've gone through or the provider has gone through an assessment to determine that this was something that we needed to explore more to keep them safe from themselves and help them to either get stabilized through medication and therapy services. That is when it's helpful. And it is also helpful when it is in some of our more youth conscious hospitalizations, meaning not every hospital is probably going to be the best place for your youth to go to. Okay. And that's what I mean. You want to make sure that you're trying to connect your youth to one that has the youth in mind, not just a generic, because youth are different than adults and we need to be mindful of that. So I would say it is helpful, but when warranted and in the right placements.
So that sounds exactly like what I was going to say, in terms of being potentially useful in crisis situations, but not necessarily a helpful tool outside of that. I do think that there are a lot of other avenues to explore, like we were just talking about in terms of the troubled teen industry, but there are other avenues as well in terms of finding mental health care providers, perhaps trying to manage symptoms with medication, finding support groups and other forms of recovery-based communities, and having that openness as a parent, guardian, caregiver, and a child, being able to create that avenue of safe communication and being able to actually talk about things without a fear of judgment or punishment. Because I do think that, say, hospitalization as a punishment for bad behavior it really cannot bring about helpful, positive recovery. It may bring about a behavior change, but that is not something necessarily that is positive. I think that when you're looking for care, you want to make sure that you are facing it in an attitude of finding recovery as opposed to changing behaviors that you don't like or make you uncomfortable as a parent or a caregiver or a guardian.
Great, thank you, and that leads me to my next question, which is we haven't yet talked a lot about what parents and caregivers go through when their youth is in a mental health crisis, and I was hoping the both of you could talk about some tips and strategies, some ways that parents can maybe change their thinking in regards to being in crisis or deal with possible feelings of guilt.
I hear a lot from parents and from families of people who are living with mental health conditions or going through a crisis situation. And yes, Ryan, there often is a sense of guilt or wanting to do more. And I think especially with youth, there can be a sense of guilt for not knowing or not recognizing what is going on with your child. But there are a lot of resources that are available for parents in when their child is going through a crisis situation. And I think the first thing, as somebody who works at NAMI Virginia, I will say that NAMI Virginia does have family support groups throughout the state, specifically for the families and loved ones of people with mental health conditions. And those are a place that parents and families can go to receive support and insight as to what other parents and families have done in similar situations. We also are the host to the Virginia Family Network, which is specifically for parents of youth under the age of 18 who are living with a mental health condition. So I think building those networks and building communities where you have other people who have an idea of what you're going through and have maybe been through similar situations themselves and can offer insight and solutions can be very useful to parents when it feels like there's nowhere to turn. Because I do think that there is quite an impact on a parent or a caregiver's mental health when their child is going through a crisis, and having that support can be very useful. Also looking to family support partners and to case managers, people who can help you navigate the mental health system, because it can be really difficult to navigate the mental health system, especially if you are not familiar with it, or if you are not coming from a place of having a lot of resources, or you are not financially set to pay hospital bills for a long, because there are a lot of barriers to accessing that can impact not just the youth going through a crisis, but their whole family. And so I think finding those support partners, finding your community, but then also understanding what social services might be available for you. That is what I would suggest to a parent or a caregiver who is immediately dealing with a situation like that.
Well put, Miranda. I think the only thing that I would add is to seek your own therapy. I mean, it goes back to, everyone being in a place of knowing where they are mentally and emotionally, knowing when your cup is empty and it needs to be refueled or refilled. So being able to have your own therapist that you can talk with, that you can process all of the things that are going on during that time of crisis with your child and even after, as well as self-care. Self-care is an important piece of it. And I think if a parent or caregiver can do those things and be honest with themselves about what they need, they will be in a better position to support their child while that is going on.
Thank you both. We are down to a couple of minutes left. And so I wanted to finish with this question. It's a two-parter. What is one thing you want a young person struggling with their mental health to hear today? And then the second one is, what is one thing you wish their parents could hear?
I think that I would want a young person to know that they are not alone and that they are cared for. And for the parent, I would want them to know that they have supports, they have a village, they just need to access it.
I think that's beautifully put, Nicole. And yeah, I say to a youth, to the youth who are struggling right now with their mental health, say I have personally been there. I have my own lived experience, and it very much sounds cliche to say it gets better. But the thing that I would say is, yes, you are not alone. There are supports out there. There are people out there who want to help you and who are equipped to give you the help that you need. And it can be scary to reach out. It can be scary to talk about what's going on, but that vulnerability and that reaching out can absolutely save your life. And to parents and caregivers, I would probably repeat, you can't pour from an empty cup. You have to be able to learn how to provide that care for yourself and to understand what you need, and give that to yourself. Give yourself permission to do what you need to do and do what feels right for you to be okay. And that you can lead by example. By you getting that help, and by talking about what's going on, and by being open about your own struggles, you can show the youth in your life that those things are okay and that getting support is okay.
Well, I'd like to extend my heartfelt thanks to you both for providing such wonderful information and for answering my questions over the last hour. On behalf of dLCV and this entire summit team, again, thank you for being here with us, and to everyone who's watching, thank you for joining us. And I hope it was informative and helpful. And thank you, everyone. Have a great day.